All right, I am here with Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence, thank you so much for accepting my invite.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually here.
Absolutely. How are you?
It's early today. So far, so good. I just wrote something that I wanted to write, so that's a good feeling to get that off my chest. And yeah, doing okay. It's lovely here where I live in this beautiful corner of the world. No snow. And how's it up there?
It's all right. No snow. We get approximately like 3 months that is okay weather, and then from there it's not not great.
I've been to Iceland twice in the summer, actually three times. Think
How'd you
about it.
like it?
Oh, I love it. It's magical, and I'm looking forward to returning. I'll be there in September, twice. Once on the way to Greenland, and once for leading a Origins project trip in Iceland. And we'll be doing several fascinating things. And I hope to actually do a public event in Reykjavik,
Oh,
probably September
I'll be
23rd or
attending
so.
that one.
Yeah,
And
I think it'll
maybe
be
we can do another one of those one of these, and when you come, let's see
okay.
how this one goes.
Yeah, okay, good. Anyway, I think it's September 23rd, but we'll work out the dates. But I'm looking forward to it.
Beautiful. All right. So, I was trying to figure out, like, you have been doing so many things throughout your life. You are a physicist, you're a professor at many like elite institutions. You run your own like origins project slash foundation. Um, what would you add to this list? Who is Lawrence Krauss for those few of those who don't know?
Well, I've been a scientist for many many years, but I've really just been someone who's interested in the world around me, and that
Hmm.
means I don't differentiate it between disciplines, especially not 19th century disciplines. Um, I've always been fascinated by science, but by other things, by politics, by history, and so I've been fortunate enough to be able to pursue my interest in my own research and have had some impact in the field. And then since I was inspired by writers. Um, I started to write, and fortunately, I've been able to write. I just finished my 12th book, and I try. I guess what I really like to do is mix together science and culture, since they both represent to me. Since science is a part of our culture, it represents to me what is most exciting about being human, and I revel in that, and I like to share that excitement with other people. So basically, I just do things that interest me, which is what I think many people do, and fortunately, I've been able to get paid for the most part to be able to do things that interest me.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction there. That most people do what they like to do, but not many get paid for it. Most people have to do some other job as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a privilege. That was the privilege of academia in some sense for a long time until academia started getting less pleasant. But yeah, the privilege is to be able to do what you want. It's a very self-indulgent activity, and I understood that and recognized the privilege I had to be able to do that. And I think one shouldn't take that lightly. And then after now in retiring, I have that other privilege that I can also do what I want. Maybe even more free now to do what I want because I can control it in more ways since I don't have to be dependent on other institutions.
All right. Well, you are. You're the president of the Origins Project and Foundation. What is this project and what is its objectives?
Well, I started it when I was still at a university. I again motivated by the desire to bring people closer to the thought leaders around the world and to connect science and culture, to create events where people could listen to the people they were most interested in who'd been doing, or even maybe people they didn't know, but who've been pushing forward ideas and concepts that are going to change our perspective of our place in the universe and affect global issues in the 21st century. And I started that with public events then when I left the university, I wanted to continue that. And the foundation is a nonprofit that has sort of three prongs. One is the podcast, which does exactly that, brings people from science and culture, from celebrities, actors, and scientists, and journalists and writers. And we have in-depth discussions where I try and do my homework. And then public events, which we're about to have again in November. We'll have two events in Phoenix, which is where it was initiated. Maybe we'll move elsewhere around the world. But one will be with Richard Dawkins and I, and another will be with me and about 4 or 5 or 6 of the world's most famous cosmologists talking about the future of cosmology. There'll be 2 public events. We hope it still remains to be seen if people will show up to public events. We'll see about that. And the last thing is to run trips where people could spend a week or two with me and various guests. The trip we're going to have in Greenland, one of the other guests will be Barry Barish, who won the Nobel Prize in physics, and have we give lectures on various subjects, but also the opportunity for people to get to interact with us on a one-to-one basis more intensely. So those three prongs allow people, I think, to get exposed to interesting ideas and interesting people. And it's hard to run a foundation in the sense that it's, you have to raise money, and at the universities it's easier because you got this institutional infrastructure. And I'm not a huge fan of trying to raise money, but we do it, and that's one of the reasons why the podcast, for example, the ad-free versions of our video podcast are on a Substack site that requires paid subscriptions for those, because that supports the podcast. People don't realize it actually takes time and money beyond my own to produce these things. And so anyway, that we'll just see, and maybe we'll move on to other things. But it's like many things I've done, an experiment, and it's an ongoing experiment to see where it can go and whether it works at all.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I've been following the Origins podcast for quite a while, and it's very interesting. You cover a wide variety of issues in which you talk about this link that is between science and culture. But to lay sort of a groundwork for our discussion today, what in your view is science?
Well, science is a process. That's the most important thing. It's not an object. It's a process by which humans have learned to be able to uncover how the world works. It's a process that involves continually experimenting and testing ideas, creating new ideas, testing them again, and that interplay, and also being open, importantly, as a social community, to criticism of ideas, or which moves the whole field forward. But basically, it's a method for overcoming our natural tendency to want to believe or to be biased, by subjecting things to constant testing, both and inquiry by yourself and other people. And that's worked out to be the most successful method that humans have developed in all of human history to understand the universe around us, and by the same token, produce technologies that have changed the world. So science is integral to our life, and it's not a game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting because I was listening earlier today with a conversation with you and Jonathan Rauch. It was a fascinating conversation in which you talk about this link of culture and science, and also the threats. In what way is this a threat, and what is the greatest threat to science today?
Well, I think the greatest threat to science, but when it's not just science, it's a society which depends upon science in a sense. Right. And to our freedom of intellectual inquiry is the growing tendency to ignore evidence, to create one's own reality based on one's desires, or to create one's own reality based on one's fears or sense of victimization or offense, to overcome objective data and to personalize the world around us. It's this kind of postmodern disease that's infected everything, and unfortunately, with the ability to do false news and have social media manias. That kind of infestation of imaginary views of the universe cannot just be individual. I mean, if an individual has an imaginary view of the universe, big deal. But when it propagates into society, that's a problem. And we see it happening with claims about things like systemic racism in science, which doesn't exist. Yet, nevertheless, it's infiltrated so much the popular consciousness that institutions and leaders of scientific institutions are reacting in a way that is not rational, and in fact abandoning the scientific method, which is to critically examine those questions. And I think we depend upon science for our health and welfare and well-being in the 21st century. There are global challenges, from climate change to other things, to pandemics, to national security, to the economy, and we can't afford to ignore reality. And that's my big concern.
Right. Yeah, it's quite interesting because I've criticized this a lot on this podcast, in which people have claimed that there is, like you said, systematic racism or sexism within these institutions. And that is just not, I'm not a scientist myself, but when I listen to scientists, my inclination goes towards that scientists don't really care where good ideas come from, because they need good ideas to prolong their process towards the truth.
Exactly. Good ideas come from all sorts of different places. And it's not as if science is a social activity. So there's a natural tendency to maybe distrust ideas that don't come from established sources. But what's great about science is the methodology of science overcomes the bias of scientists. And the methodology eventually says, hey, if that's a good idea that moves the field forward, eventually it's going to win out. And there's many examples of fringe ideas. There are many examples of stupid fringe ideas that have gone nowhere, let me say that. But there are many examples of what would initially seemed like fringe ideas that later on became proved to be central and became a central part of the field.
Right. All right. Then I want to ask you about other sciences that seem to be colliding with the STEM fields, the mathematicians, the physicists, and doctors, and the social scientists that seem to want to have a claim upon the discussion on these fields, especially with regards to sexism, racism, all of these topics that we've discussed thus far. What is the remedy to this? Like how can
I think the problem is that academics, for the most part, are a very timid group of people. In spite of the fact they have great freedom, they have great fear. Most of them are great fear of trying to keep their heads low and not be noticed, so they can do what they want. And therefore, when there's social pressures and potential ramifications of speaking out, especially if you're speaking out against some popular notion, it's very difficult to do that. And there are often negative ramifications of doing that. So scientists, like, academics tend to, like other people, be herd-like in that regard. And I think it's important that everyone be willing to speak out against dumb ideas. But scientists don't have any monopoly of knowledge on political issues. And again, I've spoken out about political issues, but people say we should have more scientists in Congress. Well, should have more people that think like scientists in Congress, namely more people who base their decisions on empirical evidence. That's all. You don't have to be a scientist to do science or to think scientifically. What we need is people who base their decisions on empirical evidence and test their ideas and test their proposals and are willing to say they're wrong. And that's it. And that's all we need. And so scientists, of course, get wrapped up in political issues, especially when they threaten science, as often has been the case in this country and elsewhere. And it's important we speak out there. And it's important we speak out on issues for which we do have expertise, or at least it's important that we and every citizen question ideas. Some of us have a bigger soapbox than others. That's all.
All right. I want to challenge this theory because Andrew Yang ran on Make Math Great Again, and the public demand doesn't seem to be upon this theory of make everything scientific. People respond to different kind of sort of emotional rhetoric, in which the politician is willing to empathize with the people rather than saying, well, scientifically speaking, XYZ.
Well, that's not going to make you to win. You have to look. It's like anything else in the popular arena. You have to, seduce people with your ideas. You have to go to where they're coming from and try and imagine the questions that are interest to them. And successful politicians can do that. Successful car salesmen can do that. Successful teachers should be able to do that. And so, of course, as Hume said, reason is the slave of passion. And I think you have to get people to the point where they are interested in what you have to say before you can talk to them about it. And so just saying, the data says this is not necessarily a very attractive way to try and encourage people to listen to what you have to say. So you have to try and package it in a way that works. And that's just a property of being human.
Mm-hmm. All right. My next question goes along the same lines. Is it possible to be a scientist completely void of the influence of politics?
Well, look, it depends what you mean by politics. We're all subject to the society in which we live, and therefore we are impacted by policies which we may or may not have any control or even any interest in. So it's impossible to be completely removed from that. I mean, some institutions, have tried to create insular groups where you basically are not, like I remember I spent time and was once offered a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And it was lovely because everything is removed, all practical concerns, and you can just sit there and revel in your thoughts. I found it stultifying, or at least claustrophobic in a sense, because I like to be more integrated in society. But so some of that's possible, but and that's what tenure is supposed to do. It used to be supposed to do that. Now it doesn't any longer. And so it's good that scientists can carry out their activities in principle without external influence in what they're doing in particular. of course, we're supported by society, and in some sense, we have to convince society to support our research. So we have to explain why it's useful. But we can never be completely insulated, because the policies of governments are going to impact on not just what science is supported, but the society in which we live, and its health and its economic well-being and its security, all of that. So it's an illusion to think you can be completely, unless you live on an island that's completely self-sufficient. And even then, if sea levels rise, you're impacted by other people's policies.
Right. Yeah, it's quite interesting. You already answered my follow-up question to this question, but I wonder now. I didn't have this written down, but it's weird to see that scientists are reluctant to raise their voice to these issues, that they're not willing to sort of defend their capability of scientific inquiry. What are your thoughts on this?
It's scary to publicly speak out. It is, and I understand why many of my colleagues are hesitant to do that. It's something I've done, and I've suffered at various times for doing so. But it's just the way, it's my nature, and but I understand it. So not every scientist should spend their time speaking out. So most scientists should spend their time doing science, and some of us can spend some of our time speaking out because it's important. But young people say to me, "How can I emulate you?" And I say, "Well, do good science." I mean, to some extent, I think my public voice has been impacted by the fact that I have scientific credentials and have scientific accomplishments. So I tell them, the best thing you can do if you're a good young scientist is do science.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, because we're talking about culture, politics, and science. When I started watching you on various like YouTube and with Harris and with Hitchens and Dawkins, and the threat always came from the right. It was always against these creationist lunatics and sort of these right wingers who had goofy ideas about science and climate change and further like that. But nowadays, I feel like the threat is coming more from the left, to sort of deny empiricism, and at the stake of they want everything to be upon emotions. Like intent doesn't matter because everything is upon the victim. What are your thoughts on this?
And I've written a lot about that, but I don't think we should be under the illusion that it's just the left. You're absolutely right. The left has got severe problems introduced by this postmodern and sort of Victorian manias. The notion that personal perception and sense of victimhood is more important than external data, and the fact that people should not be allowed to say certain things, that certain words are so hurtful they can never be mentioned. Certain ideas are so hurtful that teachers can't bring them up in class. That's an anathema to not just science, but scholarship. But it's not just that. So that's the left. And then, of course, this nonsense about critical race theory and systemic racism is a problem, and it's impacting on a lot of institutions. But the right is still equally hard working on their own cancel culture. First of all, they're using this mania of part of the most extreme part of the left, and they're using it for their own purposes to try and gain power in different ways. So they're making fun of critical race theory. They're saying we shouldn't talk about sex education because gender is such an issue that's being held up by many. Well, of course, that is equally pernicious in its own way. And of course, you're right. They don't want to talk about climate change, and they don't want to question religion, for example. So we're seeing it on both sides. But it used to be. You're absolutely right. It used to be that the defenders of free inquiry and freedom of speech were the left, and now the left has really given up on that a lot. The right is claiming to be a defender of freedom of speech when it's convenient, and you're right. And often they are attacking, and I agree with. That's why some people now claim I'm a right wing person because I happen to agree with them when they do that. But let's not fool ourselves. Those threats are coming from both sides.
Yeah, I've always claimed to be mostly free speech absolutist, and that made me usually, like in the past when I was starting to follow politics when I was about 20, that made me a leftist. And nowadays, when I claim the same claims about free speech, I'm all of a sudden a right winger.
Yeah, no, I find the same thing, and the only place. Now I publish on our Substack site, Critical Mass, but when I was publishing more for media, I could only publish in what you might call what some people would call right-wing journals. I don't think necessarily. Well, the Wall Street Journal is certainly right. I used to publish more in the New York Times, but I also publish on Quillette, which I don't think is a right-wing journal, but some people might think it is. But those are the only places that would be interested in my pieces about free speech, and so that's definitely a problem. I'm still liberal on the whole in my politics, but I'm disappointed with most politicians who are, you would call, liberal, and I find disturb me. But I always felt, I like to think I always felt free to criticize both sides of the aisle, even even many years ago when certainly I criticized when Republicans were in the presidency, but and as you probably know, I was on Barack Obama's science policy team when he was running for election, but I felt free to criticize them when they got into power, and I avoided being in the government. And I certainly am critical of many things Joe Biden is doing.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's deeply entrenched in scientific thinking that you need to have the capability of free inquiry. You need to be able to question everything. You need to be able to express your voice, regardless of how wrong you are.
And you need to be able to say, I don't know. And you need to be able to be proved to be able to be wrong and listen and learn how you're wrong. All of those things are quite important. And of course, in politics, you're not allowed to say you don't know or you're wrong, or you yourself may have been wrong. You're not allowed to change your mind or express ignorance. But it's a shame, because it should be a central part of everything, including politics. But it's a problem.
Right. All right. Because he was your friend. I mean, I usually don't have conversations without mentioning Christopher Hitchens, so I'd be remiss if I wouldn't ask you as his friend about him. He's actually, like, you see George Orwell here. Hitchens. Yeah. There's actually a picture of Hitch here opposite to him. I think he is an increasingly missed voice. I think he was.
Sure. I miss him all the time. I was going to say every day. Maybe not every day, but I miss him all the time. He was a contrarian when necessary and spoke out. And I can't help but know where you're heading. I mean, what would he think now? And who knows? Right. But I used to say, I think I even said it once when I gave the memorial address upon his death, and I was fortunate enough to be able to speak at that event. That I often think, what would some people say, what would Jesus do? And I used to say, what would a Hitch do? I think about that. When I write, sometimes I think about what might he say. And we didn't agree about everything, and I'm sure we wouldn't agree about everything today too. We didn't agree about the Iraq invasion, for example. But he was able to speak out and felt free to speak out. I unfortunately think that he would probably be marginalized and canceled by today if he was around. That people would have canceled him found reasons in his personal behavior or whatever that to have canceled him. And so in some sense, maybe he was, I don't like to say that he's not fortunate. I wish he was still alive, but he was fortunate to have missed this mania, puritanical mania, racist, this whole postmodern mania.
Yeah, I mean, in my preparation for this podcast, I was actually thinking about that. I probably watched 700 hours of his content and read his books, and it's quite interesting to observe old videos of C-SPAN, and he was raising questions that maybe he didn't even agree with about feminism and stuff like that, and he was just raising questions. What might we be getting wrong here, and what might you be getting wrong there? But you're right, that is something that has been missed or lost in the public conversation today. And do you see any remedy to this?
Well, I think situation? Some of us, none of us. Well, maybe some people do, but I don't claim to be a Hitchens. But I try and carry on. I remember. This sounds pretentious. Maybe it is, but I remember the day he died, and I remember thinking, and I was on TV being interviewed at that time. I used to do those kind of things. And I thought to myself, okay, what I'm going to try and do is carry on his legacy in whatever minor way I can. And so I think some of us are inspired by him to continue to try and in one or another small way and less eloquently, with a less beautiful English accent and maybe sometimes less humor and or gravitas maybe, to carry on some of the things he was trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And he was very fond of science. He wasn't a scientist himself, but
No, he was
he,
he was very fond of science, and he had some misplaced notion of me as a great scientist. So I used to spend we spent a lot, and I was honored that he was interested, and at the same time I understood that his potentially inflated views of me were not necessarily correct.
I would disagree that those views were inflated. I mean, you like I mentioned in the beginning, you've written like what did you say, 12 books
Yeah,
taught at the most elite institution. I mean, this is something that people should really strive to do rather than going into the. I mean, I wrote a piece here in Iceland. You wouldn't be able to read it because it's in Icelandic, but I
yeah,
was trying to
definitely.
urge people to really think about what they wanted to do about their future. Like, let's say 19-year-olds who are going into some kind of a field. Like, is there really a need for a gender major? Like, we're seeing a recession here in Iceland, where in which we need people in construction work, we need scientists, we need people in the medical field, and people are still thinking about going into studying critical race theory. And
Look, I think you can't tell people what to do. I mean, you can try and encourage them by speaking out and trying to educate. But I think people have to follow their own interests. And when people are interested in critical race theory, the best thing you can do is either ignore them if they don't have an impact, and if they do have an impact, speak out. At least ask questions, get people to think. But in the whole, I don't think you can tell people, we need scientists, therefore you should be a scientist. People they're not going to be good scientists if they're not interested in science, and so people have to follow their own interests. But hopefully, their own interests and passions could be directed towards, at the same time, having a positive impact on society.
yeah, but I mean, I would slightly disagree there because this is a problem. As I mean, America is in a worse state than in Iceland regarding these issues. I mean,
Yeah.
you have so many like stuff like that,
Yeah.
and I agree with you. We can't tell people, but we also, or this the sort of culture can't be telling people that if they do 3 years of these kind of theories, the work market will take them with open arms, because that's a lie, and they'll have $300,000 in debt and a degree in nonsense.
Well, who knows? They may become consultants to the World Bank if this nonsense continues. So, look, I think I worry about that argument, because then you'll claim that people shouldn't study art history or ancient Greece or anything else, and I think it all is part of our culture, and it's fascinating. So I do worry. I mean, you can say that this idea. I look, when I taught at Yale, we were subjected to what you now call postmodernism, in what was a literary fad called Deconstructionism, which basically said there was no objective truth, and every sentence had a social context and had to be, and usually in terms of power entities, and had to be deconstructed.
Power stratification, yeah.
And it was just gobbledygook. But it was all down the hill in the literature department, so no one else cared about it in the science departments. But it was there, and I think, one could make fun of it, and I'm happy to. I think it's important to be able to make fun of these things, offense or not. Then if it begins to have traction, then you need to be able to take it, not the ideas more seriously, but its impact on society more seriously.
Yeah, I think Hitchens talked a lot about this regarding religion, where in which he said that being able to satirize and make fun of these things was essential to like progress within these matters.
Well, I like to make jokes, and again, I've suffered because I've made jokes at various times, and other people do now too. And I think humor is an essential part. Satire is an important way, and has been for centuries, to try and illustrate or cast an important light on social problems.
Mm-hmm.
It has a great tradition in England and other places of being Jonathan Swift, for example, on his Modest Proposal, which was a satirical way of discussing child poverty in England. And I think that's an important thing to do. I think, and that's why comedians shouldn't be censored for offending, because they usually are bringing up important issues. Not always. Sometimes it's just nonsense. But I think we need to be able. Nothing is sacred, and no idea should be immune from satire, ridicule, You can ridicule ideas. I mean, ridicule people is different, but ridiculing ideas should be open game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. All right, I have two more questions. One is about religion. The criticism today, you hear this from Douglas Murray and more figures such as him, that really what we're seeing today, this postmodern media that you described, we're seeing that this is something that came into the void that religion left, and that we need religion to be able to sort of keep the construction of society. How would you answer that?
Well, no, we need science. We don't need religion, which is just one way of ignoring idea or not thinking about detailed ideas. Religion is based on belief in things for which you have no evidence generally, and belief should not be a part of our vocabulary, and certainly isn't part of the vocabulary of science.
Mm-hmm.
Science scientific thinking can fill the void, but what we have, unfortunately, when you give up religion, people are very religious anyway, but they become secularly religious. And we see this secular religion in critical race theory and other things where people, once again, have ideas which cannot be questioned. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. You can't question that. You can't say, well, what does that mean? And it's very religious in nature. And it also, just like religion, it's based on a belief for which you have no evidence. And it also stops the conversation which is what religion does. It stops the conversation when it gets interesting. The only difference between secular religion and say Christianity, pick a religion, is that one at least involves absolution and forgiveness and the other doesn't.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about the Christianity allowing that, and secular religion doesn't have any room for that.
No, it is quite an interesting landscape that where people like you said, you're either anti-racist or you're a racist, or you have to sort of subscribe to these frame of mind that everybody has to salute regardless of where they are in life. And it is scary because it really threatens everything that we've been talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's scary, and we need to speak out about it, and that's what we can do if we have the opportunity. So we do it. So,
well, we'll try until they stop us.
Yeah.
All right. Last question, and I think this is quite interesting to ask you about. Is there a case to be made that we ought not to explore some areas of scientific inquiry that we deem immoral?
Well, who's we?
Me and you.
Well, I think everyone can make that choice. Sure, every individual can decide not to. But the point is that morality is maybe in the eye of the beholder in some sense. So I think there are certain universal views which probably should be accommodated, such as you shouldn't be allowed to experiment on humans without their permission, for example, among other things. And that's kind of an accepted thing. And it's hard to imagine a reasonable culture where that wouldn't be that kind of morality wouldn't be the case. But I think scientific inquiry naturally is open-ended. Now, we as a society can decide not to follow up on it or not to support that inquiry if we think that it's not productive. But I don't think we can stop people from asking the questions. You could say, I'm a physicist. Physicists created nuclear weapons. Should we have never allowed that kind of inquiry? Well, the inquiry really was into laws of nature, and nuclear weapons were a technological aside. So can you stop people from inquiring in the physics of the nucleus for fear that it might allow the creation of serious weapons? Well, I think the answer is no. And I think it's a really touchy subject when you say we ought not to explore some areas of scientific inquiry. You have to be really careful about deciding who we is, because whoever you are, there's always someone else. And if you think you can make restrictions, then you're opening other people to make restrictions on you. So let's be very careful. I think we can ask questions, and communities have done that with genetic engineering and cloning, and saying, hold on, we as a community think that this is probably not a productive or useful or safe area of activity, and we won't support it with our research dollars, and that's appropriate. So there can be self-regulation in certain areas, but it comes from open discussion of the problems, but not from saying we a priori we can't even think about it.
All right, that's a great answer. Last question. You always ask on the Origins podcast, why aren't you a scientist? So I want to throw that back at you and ask you, why are you a scientist?
because for me, it seemed like trying to understand fundamental truths, if you want to use that word, or trying to understand the universe in ways that hadn't been understood before, seemed to me the most exciting activity humans could want to do. I became enamored from a time as a child. I like to say part of the reason maybe my mother wanted me to be a doctor, and she made the mistake of telling me doctors were scientists, and I became interested in science. It's hard to know why, but I think it was from reading. I became a scientist in large part from reading books by scientists or about scientists, which is one of the reasons why I've returned the favor. I read a book about Galileo, I remember when I was 11, that had a big impact on me. Then later on, I read books by Albert Einstein and George Gamow and Sir James Jeans and Richard Feynman, and they all impacted on me and other people. I mean, I read history, I read lots of things, but the allure of the unknown was something that I found too attractive to discount.
Who is your most favorite physicist?
People ask me for my most favorite many things, and I just don't think in those terms. I don't think hierarchically. There are many people who I greatly admire or things I really like, and I just like apples and oranges. There have been physicists that have had a big impact on me. Richard Feynman is one, and obviously Albert Einstein, and among my colleagues, people I've learned from, Steve Weinberg, Shelley Glashow, other colleagues of mine who I've worked with, colleague Frank Wilczek, and there are a lot of them. And so I don't think in terms of the best or most or whatever.
Right. All right. I'll have to let you go. For those listeners who are being first introduced to your voice, where would you direct them to hear more of these kind of things?
Well, I think obviously you mentioned the podcast, the Origins podcast, which is one thing, but to go to the foundation site, or actually go to Substack. My voice, I'm writing regularly now. It's called Critical Mass on Substack. It's Lawrence. I think it's Lawrence Krauss, or it might be Lawrence M. Krauss. I think it's Lawrence Krauss at Substack. At lawrencekrauss.substack.com. I'm pretty sure is the Substack site, and so I'm writing a lot there, and you can also see the podcast there. Also, lawrencemkrauss.com is my personal page that often indicates things where I'm doing. Anyway, those are some of the places you can hear me or see me or avoid me.
Beautiful. All right, Lawrence, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've said many things to you, but you never responded because I was always talking to the screen and you were not talking to me. But it's an absolute pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. And definitely, I'll be in touch around September, and might be doing this.
I don't think I was talking to the screen. I think I was trying to talk to you. So anyway, I hope to see you in September. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great one.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.